Hi, in this video I'll be going through paragraphs 19 to 33 of the chapter on the application of the fingers from Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's book Versuch über die wahre Art, das Klavier zu spielen. And in this video, it's not so disparate. I will change it up a little and I'll speak after certain paragraphs when I'm comparing what Bach says to the AC fingering system. Die Gestalt unserer Hände und des Griffbretts bildet uns gleichsam den Gebrauch der Finger ab. Jene gibt uns zu erkennen, dass besonders 3 Finger an jeder Hand ein ansehnliches länger sind als der kleine Finger und der Daumen. Nach dieser finden wir, dass einige Tasten tiefer liegen und vor den anderen vorstehen. Now I find it interesting that Bach begins by pointing out the difference between the black and white keys. The different positions, the fact that the white keys are lower and are situated before the black keys. And that is the same as all my discoveries, the cause of tension, the cause of unevenness, finger position, all that. They all arise from the observation of that fact that the difference between the black and white keys. So that's a similarity there. Ich werde nach der gewöhnlichen Art die Daumen mit der Ziffer 1, die kleinen mit 5, die Mittelfinger mit 3, die Finger nächst den Daumen mit 2 und die neben den kleinen Finger mit 4 bezeichnen. Okay, this is I find interesting that Bach, when he assigns the numbers to the fingers, the usual numbers, he doesn't say. He could have easily used that beautiful mind logic and said, well, we're going to call the thumb 1, the index finger 2, the middle finger 3, and so on. He could have gone on in that order, but he didn't. He ordered them 1, 5, and 3, and then 2 and 4, the index finger and the fourth finger, in a separate group. And to me that's interesting. He ordered them in the same way that the AC fingering system orders the fingers. Namely that the thumb, the middle finger and the little finger are those fingers best able to play white keys, and the second finger and fourth finger are those fingers best able to play black keys. So the AC fingering system groups the fingers in those 2 groups. And when Bach introduced how he'd number the fingers, he grouped them together in the exact same way. And I find that interesting, because I don't know how many people would group them when introducing, let's say, I bet your teacher didn't group them in that way in the lesson, or I bet you didn't group them if you were explaining the fingering to people. It's not a typical way to group the fingers. The typical way is to say 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I found that interesting. Die erhabenen und hinten stehenden Tasten werde ich in der Folge durch ihren mehr gewöhnlichen als richtigen Namen der halben Töne von den übrigen unterscheiden. Now this is interesting in that you're getting a little insight into the kind of colloquial talk of the day. And that they called them half tones or semitones, the black keys. It's the same way we call them black notes. That's a usual name, but it's not necessarily correct to call them black notes, because when you look at the notes on the page, they're all black notes. But we understand when we say the black notes that we mean the black keys. And so in Bach's day, when they said the semitones or the half tones, they mean the black keys as well. But then, of course, the keys weren't black. They were like a slightly different brown or something, but they weren't black. So, that's just a little insight into the the common speak of the time. No. Aus der im 19. Paragraph gedachten Abbildung folgt natürlicherweise, dass diese halbe Töne eigentlich für die 3 längsten Finger gehören. Hieraus entsteht die erste Hauptregel, dass der kleine Finger selten und die Daumen anders nicht als im Notfalle solche berühren. So, this first principal rule coincides or agrees with the AC fingering system. In the same that in the AC fingering system, when it comes to passage work, the thumb and the little finger will not be used to play black keys. And just as Bach says here, only in cases of necessity or rarely. And you will find as you use the AC fingering system that those situations where it's necessary are a lot less than they might appear to be at first. You might encounter a situation where you think, okay, it's necessary that I use the thumb or the little finger on a black key. And then when on a closer inspection, you'll find out that there are actually ways where you don't have to use the thumb or the little finger on a black key. So in respect of the first main principal rule of Bach's regarding fingering, it complies with the AC fingering system. Now the other thing he says, that the semitones or the black keys fundamentally are actually belong to the 3 longest fingers. That is where the AC fingering system diverges. Because according to the AC fingering system, the black keys fundamentally are actually belong to the 2nd and 4th finger. And whereas the white keys actually are fundamentally belong to the thumb, the middle finger, and the little finger. So that is where Bach deviates from the AC fingering, in that saying that the 3 longest fingers, that the black keys belong to the 3 longest fingers. Die Verschiedenheit der Gedanken, vermöge welche sie bald bald mehrstimmig, bald gehend, bald springend sind, verbindet mich von aller Art Exempel zu geben. Die einstimmigen Gedanken werden nach ihrer Tonart beurteilt. Folglich muss ich bei der Abbildung derselben von allen 24 Tonarten sowohl im Herauf- als Heruntergehen den Anfang machen. Hierauf werde ich die mehrstimmigen Gedanken durchgehen. Diesen werden Exempel mit Spannungen und Sprüngen folgen, weil man sie leicht nach den mehrstimmigen Gedanken abmessen oder gar auf harmonische Zusammenklänge zurückführen kann. Endlich werde ich von den Bindungen, von einigen Freiheiten wider die Regeln, einigen schweren Exempeln und Hilfsmitteln handeln. Zuletzt werden die Probestücke das noch Übrige nachholen, durch deren Anhängung ich in verbundenen Gedanken von allerlei Art mehr Nutzen zu stiften und mehr Lust zu dem schweren Studio der Applikatur zu erwägen geglaubt habe, als wenn ich durch Überhäufung vieler aus ihrem Zusammenhang gerissenen Exempel unerträglich und zu weitläufig worden wäre. Just quickly, when he says there that about that they can, the leaps and stretches can be traced back, to their harmonic chords or trichords, however you want to translate harmonische Zusammenklänge. That's a bit of an insight when considered into Bach's understanding of the notes and how to consider the notes or observe the notes. Yeah. Die Abwechslung der Finger ist der hauptsächlichste Vorwurf der Applikatur. Wir können mit unseren 5 Fingern nur 5 Tone nacheinander anschlagen. Folglich merke man vornehmlich 2 Mittel, wodurch wir bequem so viel Finger gleichsam kriegen, als wir brauchen. Diese 2 Mittel bestehen in dem Untersetzen und Überschlagen. Da die Natur keinen von allen Fingern so geschickt gemacht hat, sich unter die übrigen andere so zu biegen als den Daumen, so beschäftigt sich dessen Biegsamkeit samt seiner vorteilhaften Kürze ganz allein mit dem Untersetzen an den Orten und zu der Zeit, wenn die Finger nicht hinreichen wollen. So, the AC fingering system conforms with what Bach says here, in that the thumb in passage work, the thumb is reserved exclusively for this passing under. That is its main job, and it's reserved exclusively. The AC fingering system agrees with Bach in that there is no finger better at passing under than the thumb. And if you imagine it, if you consider the keys, that they're on 2 different levels. And you could say, with the black keys being higher than the white keys and further behind, you could say that the white keys are downstairs and the black keys are upstairs. And if you think with what Bach says about how the thumb, what it should be solely occupied, the function with which it should be solely occupied is this passing under. If you're putting the thumb on the black keys, it's like the thumb is upstairs. Because when you really focus in and imagine it, they're 2 different places, the black keys and the white keys. They're upstairs and downstairs. So the thumb is needed downstairs. And if you're using the thumb on black keys in passage work, it's like the other fingers will be going, they'll get to the point where they need the thumb. And then they say, where's the thumb? And the thumb will say, I'm upstairs. It's not there where it's needed. It's not available. It's upstairs. I'm upstairs. It's no use. It has to come downstairs to be used. So it always needs to be downstairs. That's the best place for the thumb. And with the AC fingering system, the thumb is always downstairs. It's never upstairs. And the idea of using the thumb indiscriminately on black and white keys, we can see that what you get is the situation when you really consider it and imagine those 2 levels, that half the time the thumb is upstairs. When the doorbell goes, the thumb can't answer the doorbell because he's upstairs. So that's where what Bach says and the AC fingering system agree or coincide. Das Überschlagen geschieht von den anderen Fingern und wird dadurch erleichtert, indem ein größerer Finger über einen kleineren oder den Daumen geschlagen wird, wenn es gleichfalls an Fingern fehlen will. Dieses Überschlagen muss durch die Übung auf eine geschickte Art ohne Verschränkung geschehen. Das Untersetzen des Daumens nach dem kleinen Finger, das Überschlagen des zweiten Fingers über den dritten, des dritten über den zweiten, des vierten über den kleinen, in Gleichen des kleinen Fingers über den Daumen ist verwerflich. So, with the AC fingering system, passing the thumb under the fifth finger is not objectionable, nor is the passing the little finger over the thumb objectionable. When it comes to passing under and crossing over, as long as those fingers are playing those keys they're best able to play, there is no restrictions regarding passing over or crossing under. And if you think about it, if you take the normal fingering of C major, which we're going to get to now in a moment, this is going to be the first example that Bach provides. And I think everybody knows the normal fingering 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4 for C, D, E, F, G, A, B. And then the thumb goes again on the C as you continue into the next octave. Well, this is in order to consider, just to consider about passing the thumb under the little finger. This is some food for thought. If you're trying to passing the thumb under, you might agree or you might notice that the point at which, the cutoff point of when it's comfortable and when it passes into the realm of what's uncomfortable is the middle finger. So the thumb can comfortably pass under the third finger, but when it's passing under the fourth finger, it's already uncomfortable. So you can consider the middle finger in terms of passing the thumb under that's as far as the budget goes. As long as you're passing the thumb under the third finger, you're within the budget. And when you pass the thumb under the fourth finger, you've already exceeded the budget. And in terms of the C major scale, playing it's the crossing under of the thumb under the fourth finger. That'll be the weakest moment of the playing when playing the C major scale. It's not ideal. That's Rachmaninoff said that the C major scale is the most difficult, or it's the most difficult to play musically. And Chopin, Bach, as you'll see, he'll call as well the C major scale the difficult ones. And everybody credits Chopin with saying that being the one to realize that B major scale is not actually difficult, even though it's considered difficult. But you'll see as we go on that Bach says exactly that same thing 80 years earlier about the so-called difficult keys in terms of how they work on the piano are the easiest keys. But that's for another video. Well, when you're passing the thumb under the fourth finger, you've already exceeded the budget. Because the cutoff point, when it's the last finger in which it's comfortable is the third finger. And let's say crossing the finger under the fourth finger puts you €500 over the budget. And let's say you're €500 over budget. And in order to get the job done properly, you need to spend an extra €40. You could ask yourself, or does that €40 really make a difference? Does it make that much difference if you're €500 over budget or €540 over budget? And if you think, if you're €500 over budget and you're missing that last thing that you get the job done properly, which is worse? Is it, you're already €500 over budget, so it's not like you're sitting pretty if you do without that extra thing you need that costs €40. But if you go €540 over budget, but you get the job done properly, well, which option is the more value? And does it really matter at that point, being €500 over budget, whether you're €540 over budget? You're still over budget. But if you're 540, you get the job done properly. And that goes the same with passing the thumb under the fourth finger. It's already uncomfortable. You're already exceeded the point at which it can happen comfortably. And so crossing the finger under the little finger, does that really make the difference? But what is happening is the fourth finger is not able to play a white key. And I would bet, and I could almost guarantee that if you examine what I'm saying there with the highest level of perception and just you really observe closely and I mean to a high degree, you will come to that same conclusion, that the fourth finger is not able to play a white key. And so what you have is you're exceeding the budget, and you're crossing the thumb under a finger when it comes to C major that wasn't able to play that white key well. Whereas if you cross the finger under the little finger, when you cross the thumb under the little finger, you're crossing it under a finger that belongs to those three fingers that can play white keys the best of all the fingers. So you're crossing it under a finger that did the job as well as it can be done by any finger. And so, which is the better option? Are you really saving? If you, when you're already over budget, if you skimp on that €40, are you really saving, or are you losing more than if you go the extra bit over budget but get the job done properly? And that is what I would say to consider when considering the idea of passing the thumb under the little finger. Den rechten Gebrauch dieser zwei Hilfsmittel werden wir aus der Ordnung der Tonleitern aufs deutlichste ersehen. Dieses ist der Hauptnutzen dieser Vorschrift. Bei gehenden Passagen durch die Tonleitern, welche sich nicht ebenso anfangen und endigen, wie sie hier abgebildet sind, versteht es sich von selbsten, dass man wegen der Folge die Finger so einteilt, dass man just damit auskommt, ohne alle Zeit verbunden zu sein, denselben Finger eben auf die Taste zu setzen und keinen anderen. Bei Tab 1 Figur 1 ist uns die Skala C-Dur im Aufsteigen vorgemalt. Wir sehen hierbei 3 Arten von Fingersetzung für jede Hand. Keine davon ist verwerflich, ungeachtet die mit dem Überschlagen des dritten Fingers über den vierten in der rechten Hand und in der linken des zweiten Fingers über den Daumen und die, allwo der Daumen in F wieder eingesetzt wird, vielleicht gewöhnlicher sein mögen als die dritte Art. Inwiefern jede gut zu brauchen ist, sehen wir aus den Exempeln bei Figur 2. So, I have them here. I am going to cut to a demonstration on the piano for the examples that Bach provides. And I'm going to, as well, first I'll play Bach, what Bach provides, and then I'll provide the AC fingering version of them. And I just want to say that as far as the AC fingering, in my video where I introduced the AC fingering system, the only restriction in terms of fingering for C major is that you don't use the fourth finger. Other than that, you are free to come up with whatever variation you like or best suits the situation. The only restriction is that you cannot use your fourth finger. With the first set of fingering, which would be one could call the normal fingering for C major, if you were to use the AC fingering system, you would use this is the right hand, you would use the little finger on B instead of the fourth finger. In the next version that he provided for the right hand, where the third finger crosses over the fourth finger, with the AC fingering system, you again would insert the fifth finger instead of the fourth finger here. In the last version that he provides, that Bach provides for the right hand, that he says is the least common or least usual, again, you would use the fifth finger instead of the fourth finger. Now, I'm not going to point out the differences in results when I play both between Bach's version and the AC fingering system, but the difference is there to be heard. So you could keep that in mind when you hear them, the differences in the result. And if you think in terms of rhythm or the character, the music, or sound, pulse, clarity, buoyancy, you will notice a difference in the results. And then, so for the left hand, the first version is this. And there is no AC fingering version that maintains the similarity with that. So there is no AC version for that first option Bach provides for the left hand. With the second version, with the AC fingering system, you would again, use the little finger instead of the fourth finger. And in the last option, Bach provides for the left hand fingering where the second finger crosses over the thumb. Aside from, to begin with the AC fingering system, you'd use the little finger instead of 4. So you'd use 5, 3, 2, 1 till the F, and from then on, you'd cross the third finger over the thumb, because the third finger is best able to play the white key. And whereas the second finger is best able to play a black key and can almost play a white key as good as a black key, but not as good. So if you would never choose the second finger over the third finger to play a white key if the third finger is doing nothing. So you would never choose 2 there. So you would use 3, 1, you'd cross the third finger. So it would be 5, 3, 2, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 3. And you can hear, maybe you can hear the difference. There definitely is a difference. I'll leave it up to you to decide what that difference is. Now the first example, Bach uses the first version of fingering for the right hand he wrote directly above the notes. And with the Alan Cochrane fingering system, you'd use the 5 on the B instead of the 4. And then you'd use 3 on the C, above middle C, instead of 5, and then the thumb. On the next example, Bach uses the middle version of the fingerings he supplied to play that. And with the Alan Cochrane fingering, you'd use the little finger instead of the fourth finger on the C. Now the next example, you can see from these examples, and here especially, how the nature of the music affects his decision as to what fingering he uses. And so when the notes are grouped in trees like this, he uses that version where the third finger passes over the fourth in the right hand, and in the left hand where the second finger passes over the thumb. And with the AC fingering system, you'd use the little finger instead of the fourth finger. So you'd pass the third finger over the little finger instead of passing it over the fourth finger. And in the left hand, you'd pass the third finger over the thumb instead of the second finger. And you'd use 5 instead of 4. And the next example, here he uses the version that he says is probably the least common, more or less. He uses that. And you could imagine from the character or the music that that might be a fast ascending run up to the D. And as it's grouped in fours, you could see how the thinking would be that if you use the thumb at the beginning of each group, it's nicely distributed among the hand in order to perform that run quickly. And the Alan Cochrane fingering system, with the Alan Cochrane fingering system, you would use the little finger instead of the fourth fingers. And what you'd have there, I'm not going to compare these like I did with that when I compared normal fingering in terms of the revolutionary etude, or compared normal fingering to those phrases that I provided when I introduced the AC fingering system. But with the AC version, you can see you're employing the entire hand in order to execute that run. And you can see that the speed is there, and you could maybe notice the difference in the rhythm of the two, or the just the overall effect. The last example, he uses that first version of the fingering directly under the notes. And there are a number of ways you could finger it with the AC fingering system. So you can see in the examples that Bach provides that he's showing the factors that can influence the decisions you make as to what fingerings you use. And I'm providing, now I'd like to provide the fingering for the C major scale. Like I said, you can use any fingering you like as long as you don't use the fourth finger. So here is a version of fingering which one could use for the C major scale in 4 octaves. I've only written out that they're in 3 octaves because just for space, but it stays the same for 4 octaves. The only variation being at the very top of the scale, where the thumb is used instead of the little finger before the very top, so that the little finger can be used to play the C at the top before it descends again. So I'll play. I'm providing this so you could try it, see how it feels, and again notice, you know, in terms of all those different criteria with which one can assess what one hears. I would say consider what I play in terms in those terms, and try it for yourself and see how it feels, how secure it feels, how stable it feels. See what kind of rhythm, what pulse you get when you play it with this fingering, as opposed to the normal fingering where you're passing the thumb under the fourth finger. And I'll play it with the right hand on its own, the left hand on its own, and then the 2 hands together. as well, I want to provide another version of AC fingering, and this time for C major for 2 octaves. And this is an extremely, I kind of came across it now, this is extremely useful in terms of it compels you in the direction of music making, and it's an extremely effective way to experience using the entire hand. And your hand is gonna start moving, and you're gonna be doing things that are outside your control when you try this. And it's very simple, and you should try it. And if you have students, young students, this is ideal for them to try, because it's close. There is no unnatural stretches or anything. It's completely natural. And when you experience yourself being pushed or compelled in a direction that's beyond your control, I would say to keep playing it, keep trying it, and let that, give yourself into that, because you will find that although it's happening outside your control, you're in safe hands. And when you try this version, and the version is if you play 2 octaves of C major just using the fingers 1, 3 and 5 alone and no other fingers. So you're using 1, 3 and 5 on C, D, E, and then again 1, 3 and 5 on F, G, A, again 1, 3 and 5 on B, C, D, so on and so on. And you go up and down playing 2 octaves. You will notice a musical event. And keep in mind, I'll demonstrate that now. And keep in mind what Rachmaninoff said about C major being the most difficult scale to play musically, or impossible, maybe, he said, to play musically. And then consider musicality. And I don't mean musical in terms of sentimentality or being sentimental, or it being emotion, or musicality being the equivalent to flower arranging or handling something with kids' gloves. I mean musicality in terms of nature, and in terms of singing qualities, and connection of the tones, and the evenness, and the pulse, and the rhythm, and how it fits in, how it becomes music. And not in terms of superficial, kind of cliched aspects that are really, they're misconceptions, that musicality is the same as it being beautiful, or sentiment is not musicality. Emotion, or projecting your emotion on notes, playing them loud or soft, is not musicality. Deciding what, how loud or how soft you play them is not musicality. So I would say consider that in terms of the musicality. Try it yourself, and if you show that to your young students, if you have young hands, and it doesn't matter what age, they are gonna get a pleasurable experience out of that, playing the scale in that way, and they're gonna always play the scale. They're gonna enjoy playing the C major scale, and just as you will enjoy playing the C major scale using the AC fingering. And normally, who enjoys playing C major scale? Nobody. Because it's normally, with normal fingering, it's not enjoyable. It doesn't feel good. So try that. 2 octaves. This is the perfect way to that, keeping the fingers bent, curved, and the thumb bent. And you will see as well, when you do this, that as Bach says, it's something that nature teaches itself. The nature will teach the passing under the thumb itself when you play the C major scale 2 octaves in this way. And just notice, just let it happen. Playing, of course, without tension, without forcing anything. You just let it happen and let nature teach you how it's meant to be done. And you're going to love it, and your students are going to love it, and you'll experience what it's like to use the entire hand. You'll start to experience the wrist working in the way it's meant to, not as the wrist, everything originating from the wrist and imposing the wrist on the music or on the piano playing, but how the piano, the wrist follows from the music making and is an integral part of the music making process, but it does not begin with the wrist. And you will see, like what he said, the way Bach begun with the keys being the black keys being on a different level to the white keys. That this is where he begins, and this is where my discoveries begin. And if you think of that research that, you know, with the likes of Dorothy Taubman, and I came across in a video that there's books been written in the 60s maybe, where scientists have documented all the different movements of the wrist and followed them in order to discover how to play piano. And that's like the equivalent of, if you think of a magician, and a magician will be doing this with his hand. And what'll happen is everybody's looking at this hand, and all the while the important stuff the magician will be doing with the other hand. But nobody notices because everybody's looking at this hand. And if you know, and those scientists or something who are looking at the wrist and looking at all the different movements, documenting all the movements of the wrist, what they have done as intelligent people is that instead of being a normal person just looking at this hand, they're studying this hand with a magnifying glass and a microscope. And they're documenting every single movement this hand does in order to figure out the magic trick. And never once do they take their idea of being intelligent is studying this more closely than a normal person. That's their understanding of intelligence. Never once looking there where it's from, where it begins, namely the black and white keys being on a different level. And if you think of it like a light source on a wall, throwing patterns on a wall, you know, they'll have examined every single pattern on that wall, that light source, in order to figure out or to understand how it works. They'll have documented every single pattern on that, and they might have documented 5,000 patterns. But what'll happen is, if you put that light source, direct that light source onto a different wall, it's going to create 5,000 new patterns. And those scientists who have examined every single pattern, the 5,001st pattern they examine, they'll be in the exact same position as they were when they examined the first one. They won't have understood why that pattern was there, and they won't be able to guess the next pattern. It's a completely new pattern. So they're as ignorant, even though they have 5,000 patterns on their list, and this is what I call the shopping list. You know, it doesn't matter how many items you have on the list. As soon as you encounter an item that's not on the list, you're as ignorant as the day you had 0 items on your shopping list. And the thing to do in order to have access to all these patterns is you have to be able to harness or use the light source. Then it doesn't matter. Then it doesn't matter when there's an infinite number of patterns, because you'll be able to create them all if you have access to the source. And you can see in my video in the Tempest Sonata in the second movement, you can see how the wrist works. And if you're there's an infinite number of ways the wrist will move depending on the musical idea. An infinite number, and all these approaches about, like with rotation and all that, concentrate on the wrist and on the shoulders and on the elbows and all that stuff. They'll be imposing how many versions, how many movements of the wrist will they have you use in order to play the music? I would guess one. And so, but there's an infinite number of ways the wrist will move in order to play the music. And they want one wrist movement to replace that infinite number of movements. You can see how absurd it is. And so it has to start, you have to harness the source. And so then it doesn't matter how many patterns that source creates, because if you control the source, the patterns will come. And you'll experience it with this scale, playing it with 1, 3, and 5. Your wrist will move by itself. You won't impose any movement on the wrist in order to play that scale in those 2 octaves, because this way of playing it with 1, 3, and 5, it's foolproof, and you will experience music making as opposed to playing notes when you try that. And that is accessing the source. And then there'll be an infinite number of wrist movements. Too many, it'll be impossible to document. You could document 1 million wrist movements in the most precise details, and the next one will be the 1,000,001st version. So, this is the scale. Try it. Figur 3 zeigt uns C-Dur im Absteigen. Es finden sich hier abermals 3 Arten von Applikatur, welche alle 3 gut sein können in gewissen Absichten, wie wir aus den unter Figur 4 angeführten Exempeln sehen. Obschon außer diesen Fällen, wobei sie so und nicht anders sein müssen, eine mehr üblich sein kann wie die andere. So here's the C major descending with those 3 options of fingerings on each hand. So again, in that option with the right hand, well, for the sake of time, I won't go through the AC versions. I'll just play them, but you can think that for every 4th finger, you use the 5th finger instead. And when crossing over, you'll use the 3rd finger instead of the 2nd finger on the right hand, and the little finger instead of the fourth finger on the left hand. Now, in the first example, in the right hand, he uses that version of the fingering on the very outside, at the very top. And the Alan Cochrane fingering will use 5 instead of the 4. On the left hand, he uses again that very outside fingering that he provides for the left hand for that example. In the next example, he uses that version where you cross the second finger over the thumb, and again you notice that it's grouped in trees. So you see how the character of the music influences his choice of fingering. And with the AC version, you'll cross the third finger over the thumb. And here it is for the left hand. Again, it's grouped in trees, and he uses the version where he passes the fourth finger over the third finger. And with the AC version, you'll cross the third finger over the little finger. And with the last example he provides for the right hand, he uses that version of the fingering directly above the C major scale, the Alan Cochrane fingering. There's no real alternative with the Alan Cochrane fingering, so you'll just finger it differently. And on the last example he provides on the left hand, for the left hand, he uses again that fingering directly below the notes. Wir lernen hierbei aus den unter Figur 2 und 4 befindlichen Exempeln, dass außer der Notwendigkeit beständig auf die Folge zu sehen, der kleine Finger allezeit gleichsam zum Hinterhalt in gehenden Passagen bleibt und hierbei nicht eher gebraucht wird, als entweder im Anfange oder wenn derselben Umfang just mit ihm zu Ende geht. Dieses versteht sich gleichfalls bei den Skalen, wo manchmal drüber steht. Außer diesem Falle nimmt man dafür den Daumen. Wegen dieses kleinen Fingers keine Verwirrung anzurichten, habe ich die Skalen bis über die Oktave verlängert, damit man die Folge desto deutlicher sehen können. Now, so this is again where what Bach says diverges from the AC fingering system. You do not use the thumb instead of the little finger with the AC fingering system. The AC fingering system considers the little finger a finger with equal rights when it comes to playing white keys as any other finger, and you would never replace the little finger with the thumb. And if you think of it in terms of being able to do a job, if you have somebody who has top qualifications to do a job, and if you replace that person with somebody who is no better qualified, who is and has that person you've replaced just standing idly by doing nothing. That is not good management. That is actually prejudice. And you can see what Bach says here about where you do keep the little finger in reserve until it, like a certain part of the passage, it happens to end with the little finger, or like he says, you'll use the little finger at the very top of scales. But otherwise you won't use it at all. That this is very much in keeping, in line with the philosophy of normal fingering. And you can see if your reaction to the AC fingering system is that it's too restrictive, in that it doesn't allow the fourth finger to be used on the little, on white keys, that normal fingering is discriminating against the little finger, and that has banned, its use has been basically banned. And you can see it in the scales. The little finger is banned, and as a token it's given the very top note. Sometimes, not all the time, but a lot of the times it's given the top note as a consolation. But other than that, it's actually been banned from scales. And in normal fingering, you think you have no restrictions, but when you use the thumb instead of the little finger, you have a finger less. And we'll see, as this is where normal fingering is inferior to the AC fingering system, and the AC fingering system is superior. You can examine it in any way. It doesn't matter. I presented it in ways that I thought of, but it doesn't matter what way you examine it. The AC fingering will come out on top. And I would challenge anybody to examine it scientifically, and the AC fingering will always win. It's going to take over, because is that not evolution? That the, survival of the fittest, it will prove to be superior. It is going to take over. It's inevitable. So you can see with the C major scale that I provided, the little finger was never, the thumb was never used instead of the little finger. And the only time the thumb was used instead of the little finger was at the top, because the little finger was needed for that top C. But it never replaced the little finger just out of prejudice or a misconception that the little finger is somehow worse. The little finger, there is no other finger as good at playing a white key as the little finger. There are other fingers, or no finger better at playing a white key. The thumb and middle finger are as good, but they're not better. So this is where it diverges with what Bach says. Einmal im Aufsteigen finden wir bei Figur 5 mit zweierlei Fingersetzung. Doch ist die, so gleich über und unter den Noten steht, die beste. Die andere kann allenfalls bei den unter Figur 6 eingeführten Exempeln gute Dienste tun. Indessen, da man noch mehrere Arten ausfindig machen könnte, wenn man die Exempel danach einrichten wollte, und solche, also dadurch dem ungeachtet nicht so natürlich wird wie die nächst den Noten, so habe ich sie mehr zur Warnung als zur Nachahmung angeführt, weil ich weiß, dass sie hier und da Mode ist. Das Unnatürliche besteht darin, dass der Daumen in das Die eingesetzt wird, ungeachtet, dass ihm mit zwei halben Tönen darauf folgt. Denn der Daumen mag sich gerne nah an den halben Tönen aufhalten. Wenigstens ist diese Hauptregel hierbei zu merken, dass der Daumen der rechten Hand im Aufsteigen nach einem oder mehreren halben Tönen, im Absteigen aber vor einem oder mehreren halben Tönen und der linken Daumen im Absteigen nach und im Aufsteigen vor den halben Tönen eingesetzt wird. Wer diese Hauptregel in den Finger hat, dem wird es allezeit fremde fallen, bei Gängen, wo halbe Töne vorkommen, den Daumen etwas entfernt von selbigen einzusetzen. Now, in spending time with this paragraph, I notice that it comes across to me with what Bach says, how he says it, that he's not entirely happy when he writes that. And he clearly states that the version directly above and below the notes is the best. And he considers, he doesn't say there's 4 versions of that fingering that he provides, it's 2. There's the one directly above and below the notes for the right and left hand is one, and the second is the ones on the outside above and below the notes. And he says the one closest to the notes is the best, in no uncertain terms. And then and you see, here is the example that he provides for the left and right hand. And in the example, he skips the black keys, the F sharp and G sharp. So he in its usefulness for that outside version, which he says is not as natural as the one above and below the notes, he shows how it can be used in that in passages where those black notes are jumped over or are left out. And so he says, he explains what's unnatural is that the thumb is used on the D, even though the E comes next, which has 2 black keys following it, the F sharp and G sharp. And the fingering that he says is the best, the most natural, is the one where the E and the A before and after the F sharp and G sharp has the thumb being used. And it's not entirely consistent here, what he's saying. And I get that from the impression I get when he says the Haupt rule, he doesn't embrace it fully. He says at least, it's like he's settling with this rule. And I could see when in terms of, ascending, when he's talking about the thumb being used after the black keys, that he looked at those 2 versions and he saw that coincided, even though the better version had the thumb on the E going up before the black keys. And so he said, I could speculate that he kind of then settled on, well, at least you can say this, that the thumb is used after the black keys and descending before the black keys. But then in the left-handed, they don't coincide with what he says about the thumb being used before the black keys. So it's not entirely consistent. And with the AC fingering system, given the fact that it's governed by a formula, the formula eliminates the need for any rules with the AC fingering system. But in terms of that principal rule that Bach presents, the AC fingering would work opposite. That the thumb would be rather used before more black keys when ascending, and when descending it'd be used after the black keys. So the AC fingering system doesn't agree with Bach here. And I looked ahead in paragraph 50, Bach presents the A major scale. And he presents only one version of fingering for the right hand. And for the left hand, he provides two. I just included, for the sake of now, the one he provided directly under the notes. And in explaining why that begins with 2 and then 1, he refers to that rule we've just read in paragraph 33. And you can see in that the fingering, it matches, is identical to the fingering he says is not so natural, is not as being not the best fingering. The fingering he includes in the ascending A minor scale as rather as a warning than to imitate. That this is the fingering for the only fingering he provides for the right hand for the A major ascending scale is identical to that. And the only note that's different is that C sharp in A major, where in A minor it's a C natural. Other than that, the notes are the same. So what he says is unnatural about that version he provides, in that the thumb is used on the D instead of on the E, that same unnaturalness is there in the A major scale. And you can see with his version of the fingering how it satisfies that rule, the principal rule, in that the thumb was used after the C sharp. And it does satisfy that rule. So in that level he stays consistent. However, he doesn't say consistent in that he is forced to use a fingering in which that unnaturalness that he criticized, that alternative A major, A minor fingering, which he seems to have, it's felt like he had to include it because it's fashionable, and that he wasn't really happy including it. Hence his saying it's there as more as a warning than as a recommendation or something to imitate. So that stays the same, that unnaturalness stays the same. So he's contradicting, he can't be happy with that, he'll have noticed that. And you'll see in the future how he says there's more instances where he has to go against that principal rule, and he says, even though there's this exception, it doesn't cancel out the usefulness of the rule. And it's true, there is usefulness in that rule. You can see with the AC fingering system how the thumb likes to stay near the black keys. But I would say that when Bach is saying about the unnaturalness of putting the thumb on the D, that I would say that is not the actual unnaturalness, that putting the thumb on the D in itself is not unnatural, and that if you were to be more precise, putting the thumb on the D is the cause of an unnatural situation that follows. But in itself, the thumb on the D in itself is not unnatural. And the unnaturalness that follows, and you can see that when you use normal A major fingering, it doesn't feel secure, it doesn't feel stable. You're unsteady. It'll never sit comfortably. You'll never be able to use the hand. And the reason is that you're using the second finger on the E and the third finger on the F sharp. So the second finger is best able to play a black key. The third finger is best able to play a white key. But you're using them in reverse. You're making the second finger play the white key and the third finger play the black key. They're doing exactly that job. Both are doing the job they're not best at doing. And that creates the unnaturalness. That creates that unsteady feeling. The feeling like you could mess up at any time. That's what's unnatural. And here I'll provide the AC fingering for A major in 4 octaves. And I'll play it. I'll demonstrate on the piano now that First on the right hand and then on the left hand separately, and then the hands together. And again, I would say to consider it in all that criteria in which you consider any musical, example. You can see with the AC fingering that the thumb is used as in the same way, in that way that Bach says is the best, in that it's on the E. It's used on the E instead of on the D. And it's always beside the black keys. And and with the rule, that principal rule, basically like I said, there's no rules with the AC fingering. The black keys will always, either the fifth, the third, or the first finger will always be next to the black key. And mainly when there's more than one black key, it'll always be the thumb and the little finger that you'll always find close beside those black keys. And you can see that the use, by acknowledging its right as a finger in its own right to play white keys, you can see how the AC fingering system avoids that unnatural situation that here in the A major scale Bach is forced into. And it causes his fingering to falter. It undermines his rule. And he doesn't stay consistent. And with Bach's fingering there, how you could correct that is, well, there's one last thing. In terms of alternating the finger between black and white keys, and the fingering that Bach provides for the A major, it doesn't alternate. It doesn't have any finger alternating between black and white keys. So in that respect, it's fine, just as the AC fingering doesn't require any finger to alternate between black and white keys. But where it falls short is that it's employing the fingers. It has the fingers doing the job it's not best at doing. Whereas the Alan Cochrane fingering for that A major scale has the fingers doing the job they're best at doing. And when you apply the AC fingering, you never have to wonder. You're never in that situation where you might have experienced that, where you're wondering, should I learn this fingering? Will it work? you'll always know the fingering works with the AC fingering system because of what it's founded on, in that every finger does the job it's best at doing. You never have to wonder, regardless of what passages is, can I play it if I use this fingering? Whereas that's been, I'm sure you'll encounter that situation where you're not sure, should I commit to this fingering? Is this fingering the best one? Will I be able to play this passage with this fingering when it's a technically demanding or difficult passage? So how you could correct the fact that the fingers are not playing the job it's best at doing is that when the thumb is on the D, if you have the thumb on the D like Bach has it on his fingering, if you play the third finger on the E and the second finger on the F sharp and then the fourth finger on the G sharp, that is a way you can make that fingering more natural with the AC fingering. Or you could, with the thumb on the D, the third finger on the E, the fourth finger on the F sharp, and then you can put the second finger on the G sharp. You can do that as well. And in that solution, you can see there is no restriction in terms of what fingers pass over what fingers. As long as those fingers are doing the job they're best able to do, you can pass over and under any finger over any other finger. And I would say try them. And so I think that's everything. There's a lot now for me to figure out, and hopefully I'll get efficient at it as I go along, and it'll definitely help when we get to the chapter on ornamentation, because there'll be a lot of musical examples and incorporating them into the videos. So yeah, that's it. Thanks. Bye.